Hey, how's it going? So quick question, why does anything exist? Like, anything. Why is there not just nothing? No, put the blunt down, I'm serious. This is one of those things that I think occurs to basically every human being, and we all either just try not to think about it, or we latch onto some vague explanation and try not to think about the parts of that don't make any sense. So today I'm going to try and do the impossible. I'm going to try and give you an honest-to-God answer. Alright, let's get into it. Okay, so why does anything exist? Because when you think about it, it kind of seems like reality shouldn't exist. I assume you felt that intuition too at some point, right? Like on some level, it seems like everything in reality has a causal temporal reason for a thing to be the way it is. And what could possibly be the thing that started the entire chain of things existing in the first place? Well, I'd like to offer my preferred solution to this whole thing. I'm actually worried I'm going to undersell how cool I think this is, because I'm obviously biased, but I think my solution to this is outrageously satisfying to think about. Now listen, I know this video concept is a little bit bold. I know the whole premise comes across like I'm pretending to be smart enough to have checked God's homework, but listen, I think there are things we can actually genuinely maybe know about existential philosophy stuff if we think about it really fucking carefully. Okay, I've got a few steps to go through to get to my answer to this question, but stick with me because I think you're really going to enjoy this. But let's start with my problem with the conventional answers to this question. A usual way of approaching this question of why anything exists in the first place is to assume that there was a first cause, and if you trace the present moment back in time, you'll eventually find the thing from which everything else originated. So let's play that out, alright? So I'll start with myself. Why do I exist? Because I was born. Why was I born? Because my parents presumably got bored of looking after my older brother and decided to spend an afternoon swapping DNA, which is frankly horrific to think about. Okay, why were they here? Because the whole species is just upright monkey people swapping DNA back and forth for hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, why were they all here? Because before them it was Homo erectus doing it, and before that it was Homo whatever else, back through apes and rodent thingies and dinosaurs and amphibians and fish and bacteria type shit, and then single cells, and then just organic chemicals bonking into each other. Okay, why to all of that? Because the Earth had the conditions for all that to happen. Okay, why did the Earth have the right conditions? Etc, etc. And you keep going with this, and it feels like you should get to some point where it's like super fundamental. Maybe space-time and all the matter and energy in the universe only came to exist because of the way the laws of physics fundamentally work. And the laws of physics work in that way because somehow it's deeply rooted in how logic itself works. And logic works in that particular way because, I don't know, pick your favorite answer. Maybe there's a multiverse or something. To be clear, that's just an example. I'm not actually making an argument for the existence of a multiverse, but just bear with me. Let's say there's, hypothetically, an infinite number of universes, and each one has some fundamental logic to it which is infinitely variable between them, and ours is one of them, and it just happens to work the way that it works. So that multiverse type scenario is just the ultimate state of reality. There's nothing deeper than the multiverse. There's nothing further back in time. The multiverse just is the multiverse. It's infinite and it's timeless and it doesn't have a deeper reason. It just exists. Okay, that's a multiverse type example I just pulled out of my ass, but you can see why that seems like a fairly good solution, right? On the surface at least. It seems to explain everything in our universe. If that was the right answer, everything you could empirically observe about the reality you experience would ultimately terminate at the multiverse. There'd be some causal chain going back to something happening in the multiverse. Now obviously for us to scientifically discover that the multiverse is the right answer would need us to find very compelling evidence that the multiverse does truly exist, which we currently don't have in reality. But let's say, for the sake of argument, next year we find irrefutable proof that this multiverse thing actually exists. I don't know, maybe we point a telescope at a patch of the sky and we see some physical edge to the universe where our universe connects to some other universe. I know that's conceptually kind of stupid, but just for the sake of argument, just suspend your disbelief for a second. So we find hard evidence of different universes existing. And let's say also something about the data that we managed to collect by looking at it also fills in the gaps in our current understanding of physics. So we'd know that the multiverse isn't just a hypothesis, but it's actually true. It would be totally irrefutable because we'd have the same strength of conviction about it as we have for the idea that 1 + 1 = 2, which is to say it will just not be disproven because we're absolutely sure about it. Okay, I know that's a lot of suspension of disbelief, but that's the complete scenario. So we have everything we need. In this example, we literally know where the universe comes from and everything about how it works with a 100% level of certainty. So here's the critical part. Would we, in this scenario, have an answer to the question of why anything exists in the first place? I would argue no. You could say that we know what every single part of physical reality is caused by, that all things we observe can be traced back to something in the multiverse that we can't interact with, in some extra-universal, primordial multiverse hyperspace, or whatever techno-bollocks apply. But I would argue that even in this case, you still don't know why the multiverse exists, right? Like, even knowing that it exists and everything in the physical world traces back to it doesn't tell us why the multiverse itself exists. Let's take another example. Let's imagine that instead of discovering there's a multiverse, we discover that God is real. Let's just pick a literal interpretation of a religious God for the sake of example. Maybe reality has a sense of humor and the one true religion turns out to be Mormonism or some shit. So imagine God straight up jump scares humanity one day, just full hog, comes out the closet, confirms himself to be real by telepathically speaking to everyone on Earth simultaneously, like when Goku was fighting Majin Buu. If you were being pedantic, you could say, well, maybe an AI-run lab released some neurotoxin and caused us all to have the same religious hallucination simultaneously, and therefore maybe God still isn't real. But to be fair, you could have made a similar example with us hallucinating seeing the edge of the universe in the previous example, so let's just say, once again, for the sake of argument, we know for a fact that this interpretation of God is real for certain. So in other words, we've taken that definite multiverse answer for what the first thing was and replaced it with a definite God answer. Okay, so the fundamental cause of all things is God. Does this answer the question of why does anything exist? Again, I would say no, because just like we have no explanation for why the multiverse would exist in the first place, we also have no explanation for why God exists either. God is apparently another thing that just exists without explanation. Okay, what about a definite Big Bang answer? Like space, time, matter, energy, existence itself. It all started at the moment of the Big Bang with nothing prior. Like time only goes back that far. But you get the same problem. Why the Big Bang? And if the answer is a Big Bang, why isn't it a multiverse? Why isn't it a God? Why isn't it some other thing? And this problem goes even deeper. Imagine if the universe had no beginning. Like our 3D universe exists in time eternally. Maybe the expansion of the universe that we're observing is just part of a cycle where it expands and contracts forever. You might think that that kind of endless universe subverts the need for an answer because, temporally speaking, the universe stretches back forever. There's no first thing that happened in this scenario. But I think you still need an answer as to why the universe exists eternally. Just as much as you need an answer as to why it exists as created by any of the other processes we mentioned already. Just because it's always been here doesn't tell you why it was necessary for it to be here in the first place. And that's a critical insight, I think. That points to an idea that what we're looking for isn't some first thing to happen in time. I mean, when you think about it, time itself is one of the things we're trying to explain the existence of, right? So the thing that causes everything can't even be an event in time, because time needs to be in it. So I'd say the actual answer has to be something more like the logic that the universe itself runs on, which is external to the universe itself. The universe needs to be totally embedded in it, rather than the other way around. So what is it that all of these solutions we've already mentioned fundamentally have in common? Like, what's the thing that makes them all kind of a shit solution to this problem? Here's what I think it is. All the solutions that people bring up have properties of their own. I think that's the issue with them. Or is properties the right word? Properties, qualities, aspects, whatever word you want to use. What I'm trying to say is that if something exists, I think that basically means that some facet of reality is one specific way, as opposed to the infinitely many number of other ways it could hypothetically have been. If something's blue, that means it isn't red or orange or yellow or green or purple or black or white or whatever. If something's big, it's not small. If something's small, it's not big. If a particle exists at point XYZ at time t with velocity v and rotation r, that's equivalent to saying that it's not doing everything other than that, right? It's specific. It's like all of infinity wants to exist simultaneously, but real objects are inhibited from being anything other than the one thing they specifically are. Wow, Jesus, maybe do pass the blunt. What I'm trying to say is, to exist is to be specific. Existence is specificity. Things that exist are an exact way. Real things have exact properties. They are precisely the way that they are and no other ways, at least philosophically speaking. So by being specific, a thing becomes real, but by being real, it needs a cause, because to have those specific properties is to require justification as to why you have those properties, as opposed to the infinite number of other properties you could theoretically have had, which is why none of those answers provided by science or religion or anything else actually fucking work. The Big Bang, the eternal universe, the creator god, the multiverse, they all have different properties from each other, and we fight with each other over it as if we're gonna figure out what the right properties are. But I think the puzzle of what the first cause is, and therefore why anything exists in the first place, isn't a search for something with the right properties, it's a search for something that doesn't have any properties. That's the only thing that can be an answer to this question. The thing that caused reality needs to be propertyless, because that's the only way it can exist without prior justification. And what is something without properties? Kinda has to be nothing, right? The first thing has to be nothing. So now all we need to know is how to get something out of nothing. You know, now that I'm saying that out loud, that might actually be a harder problem. Just kidding. This is actually basically the start of my preferred solution, so stick around. Sorry to interrupt, this is just a quick message to say, statistically speaking, you're probably not subscribed, so I'll make you a deal. Press the subscribe button and I won't come over to your house and do this. Alright, thanks. Back to the video. Okay, so we just need to figure out how to create all of reality out of nothing. It's only the hardest question physically imaginable, so it's super easy, barely an inconvenience. First off, I want to be clear about the term nothing, because the way it's normally used is a lot more vague than the way I'm trying to use it right now. In fact, when I've been writing down my thoughts on this, I've used the word null instead of nothing to differentiate the precise meaning of the concept I'm referring to versus every other use of the word nothing. Like, you can have a cardboard box with nothing in it, but you can't have a cardboard box with null in it, because null is true nothingness. So you can't put it in a box, partially because the box won't actually be empty, really. It'll have air in it, it'll have outgassed molecules from the box itself, and neutrinos passing through it, and quantum foam fizzing inside of it, and whatever else. But even if you found a way to get rid of all of that the box still exists in some location in space and time, but null has no properties. It can't be located at some particular coordinates because those are properties. So it can't be inside the box or anywhere else in the universe, or even at any finite distance from the universe. In fact, we are finite creatures with particular properties. Any thoughts we have are going to also have properties. So it's impossible to even imagine null, because imagining something is literally just imagining certain properties. So null can only exist for us as a hypothetical object for us to do thought experiments with. But null is, to my mind, the only thing which doesn't require a cause. In other words, it can and will exist without prior justification. So it existed before the universe existed, although the word before is doing a lot of heavy lifting here as well, because time only exists in the context of the space-time of our universe, so it's not really clear what before means in this context. But anyway, my point is that even if nothing exists, null exists, because null is nothing, right? It necessarily exists. As for how you get something from null, that's not necessarily obvious, but I think I found a potential solution, although it helps to think about this in a particular kind of a way. You know how you can represent a 3D cube as a drawing on a 2D piece of paper, or you can represent a 4D hypercube as a 3D model, or indeed on a 2D screen like you're currently looking at it with. But when you take stuff and flatten it into a lower dimension than it's meant to be in, all the angles and lengths end up wrong because you're missing one of the axes needed to describe all the properties it has with 100% accuracy. And I think the explanation that I'm about to give is necessarily kinda like that, because your mind is this finite thing that needs to picture things happening to understand those things, and null needs you to not do that if you want an accurate picture. So the explanation I'm going to try and give is sort of like the shadow of the real mechanism that actually happens. As in, you can understand what I'm saying, but it's a little hard to visualize. That said, I still think it's a very satisfying answer. So anyway, here's how it goes. Remember earlier when I said that to exist is to be precise? Things that exist have certain specific properties. Well, really, what I'd say is that for things to exist, they actually need two things. They need a space of potential values for the properties that they have, and then they need the actual specific value that they have within that space, right? So for example, the universe has three-dimensional space. That's the space of potential values. And then a particle has a specific value for X, Y, and Z. And I know people are going to bring up quantum physics and how particles aren't defined with total precision or whatever. I don't actually think that's an issue, but the reasons why are kind of outside the scope of this video. So for now, just suspend disbelief with me if that's a thing you have an issue with. So anyway, things that exist have specific values within a field of potential values. And null is maximally undefined because it has no properties. Zero value in all possible fields. That's what it means to be truly non-existent. You could actually imagine that there's an infinite number of different potential property fields, and our reality only has a certain finite specific number of property fields in which phenomena can happen. Like, if you were to imagine another hypothetical universe that's radically different to ours, so that it doesn't have space or time or matter or energy, but it has some other stuff that we can't even imagine, that other stuff would be different property fields, as far as I'm concerned. Ones that we can't even imagine because our minds are embedded in the fields that we have. And what I'm saying is that null is non-existence because for objects to exist is for them to have defined values within defined property fields, and null is undefined in every potential field. It's like a space with an infinite number of dimensions and no content in any of them. No specificity, no differentiation, no existence. Okay, from here, there are two steps that we need to take, and they're a little bit hard to conceptualize, but remember, this is the shadow of the true explanation that we're exploring with our stupid monkey brains, so give your imagination some slack. Okay, so null is non-existence because it's undefined in infinitely many spaces of potential, and we've characterized that as having no value in all of those spaces. Okay, so my question is there anything else which fits the definition of null? Something which is also maximally undefined, but it isn't the null that we've already described? And I would say, yes, there is something. There's at least one thing that's equivalent, and that thing is the opposite of our current conceptualization of null. Think about it. If a property field can express specific content to produce something that's real, something that exists, and a lack of specificity is non-existence, then not expressing any value in any field is one characterization of null, but also expressing every value simultaneously in all possible fields is also null. That's still maximally undefined, totally non-specific, totally undifferentiated, however you want to say it. The thing that made null null is true in both of these instances. Both total emptiness and total fullness, in their most extreme of possible extremes, are both null. It's almost kind of like how a TV screen with all black pixels is displaying something with no complexity and therefore holds essentially no data, but the same is true for a screen with all white pixels. Basically that, except instead of pixels on a screen, it's values available to an infinite number of infinitely variable fields of potential properties. So the ultimate emptiness of the infinite space of all properties and the absolute infinity of the infinite space of all potential properties are the same thing. Not similar, not comparable, literally the same exact thing. Remember, existence is specificity of properties, and these things are both maximally non-specific. These are two different ways for our primitive monkey brains to comprehend the concept of nothingness, but both of them are nothingness, both of them are null. Now, there's just one more step to take. So we've discovered two discrete characterizations of null. Like, null is one object with multiple facets to it. Now, this is actually a question. What's more likely? Do these two interpretations of null exist as two distinct forms, or do they exist in a way which is a continuous object? Like, is null more like two different objects, where one object is nothingness and the other object is everythingness, both of which lack specificity and therefore don't have the power to make anything exist? Or is null one object, and these two expressions of it are part of a continuum, like different points on a circle or a sphere, where these two characterizations are diametrically opposite from each other? Like, sure, we've only reasoned ourselves to the point of seeing these two examples so far, but I find the idea that non-existence instantly generates two discontinuous forms of itself a little bit baffling. If null simply is what it is, and it's the only thing that exists, I feel like the idea of it existing in two discrete ways is almost adding something that shouldn't be there. It's like adding complexity to the whole setup. Separation between two simultaneously true things as though they're two individual objects floating inside something larger feels to me like it needs justification in and of itself. Like, doesn't discontinuity imply a gap between these two things? How can there be a gap when these two things are the only things in existence? Doesn't a gap need space to exist between them? Doesn't space as a concept only exist within these objects, not around them? Yeah, to me it doesn't seem right. Whereas if there's simply one object, and that object can be characterized as nothingness and everythingness, and therefore needs a continuum, like a range of things in between, that arguably solves the how does anything come from nothing problem, because arguably every conceivable reality falls somewhere on the continuum between those two things, and therefore also solves the why does anything exist in the first place question. It's like really actually nothing exists, but the act of nothing existing instantaneously generates a kind of everything. It's like reality itself instantaneously becomes necessary because of this whole process. This is wild to think about. Let me recap the whole thing. So, 1, there needs to be some reason why reality exists, because reality does indeed exist, and there doesn't seem to be an internally consistent way for it to exist without a cause. 2, the first thing that caused everything else can't have a cause of its own, because then it wouldn't be the first cause, so it needs to justify its own existence. 3, the only way to have something which justifies justifies its own existence is for it to not have any properties of its own. 4, nothingness, or null as I prefer to call it, is defined as that which has no properties. 5, null can be expressed in 2 diametrically opposing ways. And 6, the existence of these 2 characterizations of null requires a continuum of other characterizations which necessarily have some properties when isolated individually. Each one of these characterizations is a reality of some kind. Therefore, our reality must be one of them, and that's why it necessarily exists. What do you think? I don't know, is it a little goofy? I really like it. To me, this is really satisfying. It seems to be logically internally consistent, I think. Doesn't require faith or magic or anything that can't be explained. It also fits into my larger philosophical worldview, which builds on this whole thing as a foundation. Interestingly, this whole thing does actually have some parts in common with some bits of some religions, at least if you go looking for it, although I might be overly receptive to seeing patterns because I've clearly thought way too much about this model. But yeah, depending on the religion and the person, the word God can do a shitload of heavy lifting of concepts which are actually very different from each other. So if you have a fairly loose spiritual kind of idea of what the term God means, then you might actually look at what I've just described and say, yeah, you're just describing God. It's a thing that creates stuff and is everything. That's God. You're just describing why God needs to exist. Like, you can point to null as something that permeates everything while also being infinitely far away at the same time and be like, yeah, sounds like omnipresence to me, bro. And I know what they mean, but the term God has a lot of baggage to me, and it relates to ideas which don't really apply in this scenario. Other people might call this a multiverse, given the kind of infinite realities that pop out at the end. Although my take on what reality actually is probably not what most people think it is. I did a video called Is the Physical Universe Just an Illusion, where I go into that a little bit. Anyway, I have difficulty when someone asks, hey, are you an atheist or do you believe in God? Because to give them an honest answer, I've basically got to read them this video script, and even then it doesn't clearly fit into the God box or the not God box. So in the same way that I call nothing null, like I've come up with a different word to call it that lets me try and be a bit more specific, I also call this first cause thing the fundament. Not God, not infinity, not the multiverse, the fundament. Which I think is fairly neutral sounding and is also sufficiently descriptive of the concept, right? The fundament of reality is the very base of reality. It's the foundational thing that caused all other things. So basically, the way I describe everything that I've said today in this video in the most streamlined way possible is the fundament of reality is null. I do think you can quibble with the exact process of how you get from null to reality if you're not convinced with the way that I've put it together here, but I would say the fact that nothingness has to be the starting point is a pretty strong philosophical position. I feel pretty confident in that. Anyway, the word fundament just means the foundation or basis of something, which I thought was appropriate for this application, so I've used the word fundament a lot in my notes about this subject, which made it tragically hilarious when I found out the secondary meaning of the word fundament, which is someone's butthole. So, you know, that's great. Could have done with knowing that before I spent several years baking the term into my inner monologue, but whatever. Life really does have a sense of humor sometimes. I'll finish off with a final note, which is I've never been a religious person. Like, when I was a kid or a teen, I was always the slightly obnoxious atheist type. I mean, I still am when I'm dealing with folks with a very literal interpretation of religious stuff, because I find it funny. If you think God is like a literal dude, it's just, I don't know, it's a bit silly. But I have also heard religious people speak, and they'll say something sometimes, just occasionally, that will resonate with me. And I've realized that when that happens, it's because the religious person is getting dangerously close to describing God in a way that aligns with what I would call the fundament of reality. I once heard a religious person say something to the effect of, the definition of the term divine is something which is perfect because it can't do anything but just kind of sit there and be its perfect self, and therefore to become real or make parts of itself become real, it needs to surrender its own perfection and take specific mortal form and become flesh or whatever. I'm paraphrasing a lot, but like, dude, you are so close to getting it, and simultaneously so far away from getting it. Because I do think, as crazy as you can get with all this philosophy stuff, you do still have to approach it as rationally as possible, or you quickly end up mixing genuine insight with, in my mind, poorly thought out mumbo jumbo. Anyway, I gotta wrap this up. I ate a big lunch, and without putting too fine a point on it, me and my fundament have got some work to do. As always, thanks to my elite level supporters, Thunderbolt22A10, who fundamentally wishes I would stop talking, Nomad Greg, who brought me a gift basket from the next universe over, Andrew Mall, who once tore an ostrich in half with his bare hands, John Bejarano, who successfully put that ostrich back together again, JDK, who has a PhD, a pretty huge dong, and thanks to all my other supporters too. Don't forget to join the Patreon or the channel membership if you want to be featured in my video credits or chat on Discord, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.